3 chilling, true, scary stories that will haunt you forever. These are not urban legends. They are first-hand accounts from people who woke up in the middle of the night, who scrolled a single wrong swipe, who thought an empty trail was nothing more than quiet. Respect what they lived through. Respect their survival. Story 1. The Motel at the Edge of Town. I was told at the start that the job would be routine. A refrigeration tech with a 2-day window, a broken unit behind a diner, a motel room paid for by the company, 1 night, possibly 2, just enough to sleep between calls. The town is small, 1 main road, a handful of businesses, the kind of place where the streetlights feel far apart. The motel sat at the edge of town, a single-story building with a neon sign that flickered like it was trying to decide whether to stay lit. It smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. The clerk in the office, an older woman, probably in her 60s, gave me the room key without looking up for long. Her voice had the dry, practical cadence of someone who'd seen a lot. "You get assigned room 12. Don't open that door after dark." She did not elaborate. The look on her face did. I took the room, because that's what you do when you're on the clock. The room was basic. Cheap bedspread, the hum of a refrigerator that worked too hard, curtains drawn against the small window by the bed. Somewhere behind the thin walls, the world kept going. Cars on the road, a dog barking at odd hours. I remember turning off the light and feeling absurdly watched, like the motel itself was exhaling. The first night I noticed the truck. Dark green, heavy wheels, an older model pickup that parked outside and stayed. It pulled in slowly, idling as if the driver was considering. When I went out for a cigarette, I caught the tail end of headlights disappearing down the road. The next morning the truck was there again, sitting, waiting. A small alarm bell rang in my head, but it felt like superstition in a cold town. People come and go. Trucks park outside motels. I told myself it was nothing. That second night things shifted. Around midnight, the hallway was suddenly alive with the sound of feet, bare feet, quiet and deliberate, moving past the doors. Not running, not loud, but a pacing like someone trying out the rhythm of the place. I froze on the bed and listened to the floorboards sigh. Moments later, someone knocked. Not a mistake, not a polite knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps at my door that felt wrong because of their timing. 1 random tap could be a roommate coming back. 3, slow and patient, felt like someone testing a lock. I didn't open. I cracked the door a sliver and asked who it was. There was silence, and then, very low, a voice outside, male, unhurried, said nothing I could understand. Maybe a name, maybe nothing at all. The doorknob did not jiggle, but the light under the door grew slightly brighter as a flashlight beam pressed against the floor's edge. When it stopped, I could hear slight movement along the wall below my peephole, like fabric brushing concrete. It's the kind of sound you don't expect in a motel room, a human making space under someone else's eye. I pulled the curtains so no one could see the peephole and lay awake, hands numb, listening to someone else rearrange the night. Time becomes strange in that suspended fear. The minutes are both long and compressed until something decisive happens. The sound shifted. It went to the window. I heard a faint scrape, then a soft clink that could have been a latch being tested. The small bathroom window, set higher, narrow, creaked open. I pictured a hand reaching in, a silhouette bending, the glass shifting. I called the office from inside the room. The clerk was there, awake enough to hear that my voice didn't sound composed. She told me to stay put, to not open the door, and that someone would be out in 15 minutes. A man I now knew as the motel owner answered the phone when I called again. His tone clipped. He said they'd check. He said, "We'll be right there." But a different voice, one that slipped through without warmth, suggested I stay calm and don't go outside. Those were not comforting words. They were a precaution with no plan attached. When the noises outside intensified, when there was a heavier step and then a scuttling that made the plaster above the peephole tremble, I made the call I always imagine people will make and somehow put off until it's too late. I called the police. The dispatcher was direct and professional. They said officers were en route. The waiting was an ordeal. Every small sound was amplified. I could hear someone lower themselves to just below the peephole, a soft scrape against the door, as if someone were settling in to watch. There is a particular kind of exposure that comes from knowing someone has made you an object to observe. It is not random. It is deliberate. Minutes stretched, I could barely breathe. I remember a tapping on the window, a deliberate flat sound, tap, 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 the kind of rhythm someone uses to make contact when they cannot get to the front. The flashlight beam returned and traced the curtains in a slow, methodical sweep, as if someone hoped to see if there was movement inside. Then, almost as if testing how far they could push it, there were marks, scrapes along the windowsill, tiny pry marks at the frame, careful, practiced. The motel window had been forced, just enough to make a noise, but not enough to leave a gaping hole. That sounded like election. Someone testing boundaries. I will not reconstruct every small motion, because that would be to dramatize what was already terrifying. What matters are the facts that followed. The police came. They were older men with quiet faces, who took notes and moved like they had seen similar nights before. They asked me questions about the truck and about whether I'd seen the driver. When I described the timing, the truck 2 nights in a row, the way the knock came after the truck arrived, their expressions hardened in a way that told me this wasn't an isolated oddball. The officers searched the exterior with flashlights and boots and found something that pulled the entire scene into the cold light of intent. A torn piece of paper, a scrap ripped from some local circular, shoved into the shrubbery near the motel's lawn. On it, someone had scrawled a room number and a license plate partial, folded and tucked like a calling card. The scrap had my assigned room number and the plate that matched the truck sitting in the long grass. It was a sliver of proof that the presence outside wasn't random curiosity. Someone had been watching names and numbers and making notes. The paper was damp. The edges had stuck together and been pried apart. It looked like the hand of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity. I left that night at 1 in the morning. I packed in a blur and walked through the parking lot where the shadow of the green pickup pooled under a sodium lamp. It was still there, as if waiting for the lesson to finish. I drove until the highway and didn't stop until I felt myself coming back to a place where streetlights were frequent and loud. My company reassigned me from the region for a while. I learned over the next week that I was not the only out-of-town man to have had notes left near his room, that other workers had seen the same truck linger, the same pattern of watching. The motel clerk later told me in a quieter voice that this had been going on for months. Men passing through, men who slept, who carried tools, who didn't draw attention until someone wanted to test them. The owner had been evasive when confronted by me and by the police at different times. He told the officers he hadn't seen anything unusual. He told me to be careful and called it nothing to make a fuss about. Evasion is another kind of presence. There is something about small places where many people come through that gives predators a chance to operate undetected. The staff look away, the town sleeps, the truck waits. Afterwards, the nights were different. The engineering of my life changed in small, mechanical ways, shifting hotel chains, taking different drives, but the larger effect was quieter and more corrosive. I stopped assuming an empty building implied safety. I felt watched in elevators now, in hospital lobbies, in stairwells. I learned that predators don't always arrive shouting. They learn the hours when people are thin, and they pick them. The motel incident left me with a map in my head. Points to avoid, faces to watch. That map was not useful. It was a ledger of wariness. The kicker was simple. Isolation makes targets. The motel sat at the edge of town, a place meant to be anonymous, and that anonymity is what the watcher counted on. If that first story didn't send a chill down your spine, wait until the next one. If this kind of true account is the kind you come for, and you want to hear more stories like these, take a second to like and subscribe. There are more real encounters coming, and they need to be heard. Story 2. Swipe right. Step back. She matches him on an app, and at first he seems like any other man. Polite messages, photos that suggest a life of beer lounges and sunrise hikes. He calls himself Killian. The name sits oddly next to some of the messages, poetic at times, possessive at others. She tells me she liked his laugh in his voice notes, the way he would send a midday thinking of you, and then disappear for hours. The early routine is ordinary. Meet for drinks, texts that fill the empty corners of the day, small plans that become habits. She leaves herself open just enough to trust. Possessiveness doesn't arrive as a single moment. It is a rope that tightens by inches. At first, it's a string of messages when she doesn't reply right away, a question about where she is with an expectation of immediate transparency. Why aren't you answering becomes, where are you? Becomes, who are you with? He starts to test bounds, asking whether she wants him to come over, insisting that he knows what's best. She laughs it off with friends. She marks it in her head as a quirk. She tells herself she can manage it. Most people meet a new personality and give it a chance, but the tones shift. The thinking of you notes become surveillance in small packages. He asks for details, then larger details. The name of the building she works in, the color of the bus stop she waits at, the route she takes home. Each request feels rationalized. I get worried. But there's an edge now, a sense that knowledge is being collected like a set of keys. She tells him politely to stop asking. He apologizes, and then he asks again in different words. There are signs her friends pick up. His impatience when she mentions plans without him, small comments about other men that are laced with insinuation. She starts changing her routines without naming it, leaving at different times, rerouting her walk. Those changes are invisible to everyone but her. They are survival by stealth. She thinks, naively, that being aware is enough. She has no reason to believe it will become violence. The escalation begins with words. He says things that are meant to unsettle, that only he can love her the way she needs, that if she leaves sometimes, we both know how people end up. The language is heavy, pointed, and then it's punctuated by small acts meant to show he is watching him, showing up where she is, claiming coincidence when it is not. She tells him to stop. He accepts, and then reappears the next week with a smile and a gift. He will say, in private messages, that she should never share him with other people because no one would ever understand him like she could. Ownership masquerades as love. On a night she thinks will be harmless, she walks through a side street after a bar closes. She is not intoxicated, just alone. She is keeping her phone in her pocket and trying to get home. He catches up. She sees his silhouette before she recognizes him, a man stepping out of a shadow where there is no reason for anyone to be waiting. He grabs her arm with enough force to hurt. She tries to pull away. He smiles in a way that doesn't include warmth. There are words she will not repeat often. What matters is that the attack is sudden, brutal, in the way a car hits a curb. She ends up on the pavement, breath stolen, scrapes where her palms met concrete. People pass and step over like the incident is a puddle. She reports it to the police. At first, they ask the usual questions. Did you provoke him? Were you drinking? Do you know his name? She says yes, she knows his name. When they tell her about restraining orders and what they can do, she leaves with a small plastic tracking device placed in her coat pocket by an officer, a little object meant as reassurance. Someone is taking the danger seriously in that one moment. The object becomes a physical reminder that she cannot fully move on. Afterwards, she cannot stop hearing him in sudden silences, on late trains, in nearby doorways. She changes jobs, moves apartments, and yet the fear follows. He had learned places she went. He knew the bus she took. The fact that he existed in the infrastructure of her life made routine into risk. The attack was not cinematic. It was a series of moves made by someone who believed they had the right to control a woman's presence. He left her in the street to catch a bus, as if to prove he could break her and still be punctual. She survived. She was bruised in body and in trust. The small evidence collected later, texts, a record of a ride share he took, a similar social media account that linked him to the same neighborhood, suggested he was not always alone. He had patterns. The police allowed that he fit the description in several similar complaints. They told her something every victim is told, again and again, that they take reports seriously. They offered monitoring and suggested she keep friends informed. The monitoring felt less like protection and more like a bandage. When a person knows where you live and how you move, the feeling of a home dissolves slowly. I make myself slow down whenever I retell the parts she told me in a whisper. Words like control and possession can sound abstract when you read them on paper, but they are concrete in the way someone occupies the space next to you and then refuses to let it go. He told her in private that if he couldn't have her, no one would. That line is a vow in two parts, a promise of obsession and a warning. He used the language of possession to justify violence. That's how men like him think. They equate proximity to right. She told me she tried to avoid the places he liked. She deleted apps, changed routines, and she accepted that the world itself had become a calendar of potential encounters. The aftermath was a life redesigned around where a man had once decided to stand. You can see the cost in small things. The way she no longer drinks coffee beside certain windows, the hours she refuses to walk alone, the names of others who remind her she is not to be blamed. Survival left its mark, but it was the only thing that kept her moving forward. And this is where I stop the moment, because there's a point in the story where the friction becomes something worse. There is a late night he shows up at a bus stop she thought she had avoided, where the shape of his shadow is something she recognizes before the sound. There are footsteps that fall into the same pace as her heartbeat. There's the sense of a plan being completed. But not yet. There's still a breath between the lead-in and the strike. There's still a moment where decisions are quiet. The rest of the story hangs on what happens next. I won't rush it. But there is more coming, and it's not something you want to miss. And finally, one night in the woods. End of this segment. There's a breath, then the world contracts. She remembers the shape of him more than the words. The way his hand closed like a vice, the sudden absence of the street's white noise, as if the city folded away to let him speak. He stopped being a man she'd joked with over messages and became a force with a single intention. She fights, she kicks, she tastes blood, metallic and small, and there's the sharp, ridiculous clarity of thinking, this is really happening. Every move feels amplified. Each scramble to get back to her feet, each grab that pins her. He slams her against a wall to quiet her. He leans into a voice that promises ruin if she speaks. He says things meant to erase her choices, to make her feel owned. Then, almost as if he's keeping to an errand, he steps back, grooms his expression into something bland, and walks away, leaving her on the pavement, hands shaking, breath coming in frantic pulls. He leaves as casually as someone catching a bus. People walked past. A few blinked, some looked away. One called someone on a phone. The world doing what the world so often does, moving forward. She makes it to a storefront and holds herself until the police come, until evidence can be gathered that the night was not a private failing, but a crime. The officers listen, taking notes with clinical care. They take photographs of bruises and scrapes, copy messages from her phone, and they log his name into a system. They take what can be taken: messages, timestamps, the awkward utilitarian snapshots of what used to be a life that felt safe. An officer places a small tracking device into her coat pocket. He does it with a quiet efficiency, like handing over a bandage. It is both practical and symbolic, something to hold in her palm when sleep won't come, proof that someone outside of the incident is watching now too. They discuss restraining orders and options. The paperwork is procedural, the violation is not. There are follow-up calls, check-ins that arrive like late echoes of the night. She is told that others have spoken about a man answering parts of his description. She is given the option to pursue charges. She takes the steps she can stomach. The legal machinery moves, slowly, grinding against emotional wear. But the aftermath is not just legal. It is an architecture of small deficits that change a person's day-to-day. She no longer takes certain routes. She declines invitations to places she loved. Her friends learn to text more frequently, to ask where she is, without making her feel weak. The tracking device is both reassurance and reminder. A tiny, humming testimony that the world can be guarded in pieces, but that the past cannot be unmade. She learned to sleep with the blinds fully closed. She learned not to trust a silhouette in the dark. And yet, sometimes the danger is less about new monsters than about the ordinary people who refuse to cede control. The police files later show a pattern: similar calls, similar language, the same name cropping up in threads, in messages, in scattered complaints from women who had brushed up against the same possessive insistence. He fit the pattern of escalation: small jealousies, then surveillance, then violence. It was a pattern that any careful reader would recognize if they looked. He had learned how proximity functions as a tool: gather information, find routines, undermine autonomy. In the aftermath, those he hurt were left with the slow labor of reclaiming space. She told me she wanted to be remembered as more than a number on a report. She wanted people to hear how possession looks, how it creeps into a life with compliments and then tightens with threats. She'd said something to me that lodged in my mind. Surviving is not a single climax. It's a series of tiny decisions to keep moving, to call someone, to speak the name of the man who reached for you. Her life didn't revert to what it had been, but it continued. She took steps forward on her own terms, slowly, because there was no miracle to make it vanish, only the slow work of reassembling a sense of safety. The pattern that emerges from her story is brutal in its simplicity. Familiarity is the tool of predators. They cultivate closeness until familiarity itself becomes control. Her story is a warning and a testament. It's about a life that had to be redesigned because someone decided they had a claim on it. And finally, one night in the woods. Mike thinks about the simplest things first when he tells the story. The gravel crunch at the rest stop, the exact flavor of coffee from a highway diner that felt like a landmark, the way the Smokies roll like a long, patient sea. He drove out alone for the usual reasons: space, a campfire, a chance to be a little less networked for a couple of nights. He wanted a single tent, a book, a cooler with something that tasted good by an open flame. The drive itself was an equation of small satisfactions: the hum of the car, the radio dialed to static and the occasional song, the trees expanding like curtains. He pulled into a diner at the edge of the park, ate something greasy and perfect, and then noticed a man at the counter who watched him with an attention that felt off, like a hand lightly hovering over the table, waiting to claim the plate. The man smiled and turned away, but the feeling of being measured followed him out into the parking lot. He found a campsite near a creek, the kind of site that looks perfect in daylight: flat ground, a ring of rocks for a fire, trees for a little privacy. He set up his tent, gathered wood, and built a fire that fit the dimensions of a person who wanted to sit for a long time without company. The night closed in. The stars came out like an accusation. He could hear insects, the distant call of something larger, and the creek's small, unending rumor. He made coffee at sunset and watched the steam rise into the dark. At first, the skittishness is a small thing, the impression that someone else is nearby, a distant footstep that could be an animal or a person. He tells himself it's nothing, but the sounds come back, closer each time. A snap of a twig, a rustle higher on the slope, a shadow that moves where there shouldn't be one. He remembers thinking the man from the diner who watched him had maybe decided to camp nearby too. He had told himself not to worry. Wrong turns happen in remote places. That night the tent felt thin. There were sounds of someone pacing, a soft, circular pattern of steps that went around his sight again and again. He could hear them pass by at intervals, there, then away, there again, measured and deliberate. They were not the heavy, aimless stomps of a deer. They were human footsteps, the cadence of a person making a circuit to see if anything moved. Each pass scraped at his nerves like a fingernail down a chalkboard. He lay awake and listened to someone outline the perimeter of his camp in the dark. At one point, he heard a sound at the tent, an exhale right outside the fabric. He could feel the canvas tremble as someone breathed close enough to fog the outside a little. His heart slammed. Every instinct told him not to unzip, not to appear. He kept silent and held the tent tight to his ears, trying to pass the night into animal and human. The steps paused and then resumed, moving away in the same orbit. He waited for dawn, as a kind of promise. Light will make everything sensible again. Dawn came with a cold that stained his limbs. He unzipped his tent and crawled out, expecting the usual, a few dropped wrappers, the remains of a campfire. Instead, he saw the tracks. Dozens of prints ran through the soft earth, many of them in groups that suggested movement back and forth, then away, then back. The runs splashed across the site in different directions, like someone had been practicing a pattern and then fled quick. The worst part was the absence. His pack was gone. His cooler, with the food he had planned to eat for 2 days, was gone. His stove, his lantern, everything that would make a camp comfortable had been taken. Only the ring of charred stones remained where the fire had been, black as a fingerprint. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious damage to the tent other than the way the edges had been snapped by being packed poorly and left to the rain. It was as if someone had wanted to remove his presence with minimal fuss. Pack up the things that prove you were here and leave the space like a neat erasure. The pattern of the footprints suggested several people, not one. Multiple sets of soles cut across the clearing, some overlapping, some running in spurts. He drove his fingers through the ash ring and felt the grit under his nails. He called the ranger station within the hour. He reported the theft, the prints, the way the night had felt like a rehearsal. The ranger said thefts happen sometimes. Camp gear isn't tethered like the fixed things in civilization, but they also listened with the courtesy of someone who had seen more than they wished. They told him to file a report and to stay at the ranger station until further instructions felt reasonable. He stayed until his stomach unclenched into something like breath. Then, with an economy of motion, he loaded his car and drove home. He did not spend another night alone in the woods after that. He told folks later that it wasn't the taking of things that bothered him most. It was the knowledge that someone had been close enough to study his habits, to walk the rings of his life while he slept. The absence of his gear was a message, not just theft. Someone could come in and take the things that make you a person for a weekend and leave you with the unnerving sense that you had been observed as if you were an exhibit. He found himself avoiding remote trips, choosing cabins with closed-in spaces, feeling the hollowness of places he once found restorative. Each of these stories ends with a different set of practical results. Police reports, tracking devices, reassignment from a job, an aversion to lone camping, but they all leave the same aftertaste, a map of fear. Each survivor learned to read the world with a different eye. Each rebuilt parts of their life around the knowledge that routine is a vulnerability predators exploit. The motel watcher left a torn scrap of paper that proved intent. Killian left a string of messages and a night that mapped his escalation. The woods took gear and left footprints that testified to multiple people at work. The evidence is mundane, but that banality is what makes it scarier. Predators often prefer the ordinary. It's easier to slip in when the world is looking the other way. What binds these accounts together is the way predators pick at seams. The motel offered anonymity and slow rhythms. Online dating offered intimacy without obligation. The wilderness offered perceived safety precisely because it's removed from witnesses. The common logic is mercilessly practical. Find where a person is most likely to be alone. Study the pattern. Exploit the quiet. Predators do their best work when the world assumes the ordinary will protect us. And yet, these are also stories about survival. Not miraculous escapes, not cinematic last stands, but the stubborn continuation of a life after violation. People learned to change routes, to avoid certain parking lots, to accept safety measures they would have once laughed off. They called the police, they filed reports, they told friends, they rebuilt routines that accounted for someone else's cruelty. They lived on. The last thing that stays with me from all three accounts is the subtlety of the invasion. None of the perpetrators arrived with sirens. They came in slow steps, in small requests, in the patient waiting outside a door. They practiced a kind of ordinary cruelty that slides into a life before you have time to name it. That's the true horror. The way our most ordinary actions, falling asleep in a motel, swiping right, pitching a tent, can be turned into a timetable for someone else's appetite. This is not meant to make anyone paranoid in a vacuum. It is meant to provoke attention and caution and to honor what survivors endured. If you listened closely, you heard the evidence. The torn scrap with a room number and a partial plate. The messages that turned possessive, the footprints that mapped multiple movements in the night. Those are the traces that turn a story from rumor to fact. There is a final silence that follows all of this, a quiet that presses against you when you leave the video and step back into your apartment or car or the world outside. It is not the silence of safety. It is the residue of vigilance. Let that quiet be a call to look out for each other, to not shrug off a story because it makes us uncomfortable, to check on a friend who says something odd about a new match or who sounds tired after a night shift. If you have a true encounter, something that unsettled you, something you lived through, consider sharing it below. These stories matter because they build a map others can use. Subscribe if you want more real accounts collected and told with care. There are more survivors whose voices deserve to be heard. Lock your doors, yes, but also, when you can, look up. The danger prefers us when we are alone, and predators like company only when it's invisible.